Yeah, so I've worked myself for all three company types, and I think the time horizon is one that maybe earlier on in my career I underestimated how impactful that is to somebody working for one of these companies. I mean, with biotechs, it's kind of self-explanatory. If you're joining a pre-commercial launch, your trials need to go well and your drug needs to launch successfully, right? And that's the whole future of the company. But what I thought was fascinating when you were talking about the short horizon for VC firms, I'm not sure how this is in the CDMO space, but in software organizations, they're going to send you up like a rocket ship. And if you make it to space, great, but 9 out of 10 are going to explode in the atmosphere, and that's just part of the model, right? And so that can be a very weird place to operate. And it's something that honestly, I'm sometimes surprised more like procurement folk aren't interested in what are the models and where does that mean. But I'm assuming CDMOs aren't quite that, 3 years boom or bust. Hopefully you get a little bit more runway.
Hello, and welcome to Pharma Sessions, a place for pharmaceutical leaders to come and learn from each other. I'm your host, Jonathan Kaskey. Technology and market trends are bringing change at an ever-accelerating rate, and no person, team, or company can afford to be left behind. Here, we dive into the strategies and tactics that our guests use to tackle these challenges and create new opportunities, and how you can do the same in your own organization.
This episode of Pharma Sessions is sponsored by Xsunt, makers of the X1 reporting platform. On today's episode of Pharma Sessions, I'm thrilled to welcome Eytan Abraham, Chief Commercial and Technology Officer at Minaris Advanced Therapies, a global leader in cell and gene therapy manufacturing and biosafety testing. Eytan brings over a decade of experience across cell and gene therapy development, CDMOs, and biotech innovation, with leadership roles spanning organizations like Lonza and Resilience. He's got a really unique perspective across both public and VC-backed and PE-backed environments to understand what it takes to build, scale, and optimize advanced therapy manufacturing. So today we're going to dive into how companies can choose the right CDMO partners, the future of cell and gene therapy manufacturing, the hard-earned lessons behind building sustainable, high-performance organizations in a very complex area of medicine. Welcome to the show, Eytan.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
Absolutely. So before we do all that, it's always nice to get to know each other a little bit. And I have a question I like to ask, which is, okay, it's 1:05 p.m. Eastern on a Monday. What have you had to eat so far today?
I have had to eat coffee and soda water.
Coffee and soda water. Wow.
I know that's not considered eating, more drinking, but yes.
I certainly don't consider it eating, but I will say that I've had many guests who skip breakfast. Very few guests who skip coffee. So I don't know what that exactly that means for the future of the industry, but that's just something I'm noticing.
I guess it's a good sign that we're busy, right?
I guess so. So all right. So Eytan, you spent your career really kind of at this intersection of science and manufacturing, commercialization. What originally drew you to the cell and gene therapy space, and what's kept you there?
Yeah, sure. So my PhD was in molecular biology and developmental biology. And, I think it's fascinating to see how organisms develop. And obviously the very key role that cell division and cell function has as part of development. I actually worked on Zebrafish, a Zebrafish model for neuronal development in the central nervous system. And that got me very interested in cell function and what cells can do, the amazing things cells can tailor themselves to do. So that led me to be very interested in cells and what they can do. And then I started hearing about cell therapy and the fact that cells are being used as a therapeutic modality. And that sort of led me to my postdoctorate, which was focused on cell therapy and tissue engineering, primarily around how to use cells, including cells in certain scaffolds to elicit a therapeutic result.
Excellent. And so then when did you make the jump to industry?
So after my postdoc, I mean, actually, frankly, during my PhD, I decided that academia is not what I want to do long term. So after my postdoc, which was more translational research as opposed to my basic research for my PhD, I immediately moved over to industry. And my first job was with a early phase biotech cell therapy company working on using cells for various clinical indications, primarily cardiovascular indications.
So you were on the pharma side, and then eventually I mean, is that where you got exposure to the manufacturing piece of it, or how did that all work?
Yeah, so that was really interesting because the company I joined, we were maybe 20 people when I started. So as you know, in startup biotechs and that size of a company, everyone does everything.
Yes.
So, as part of that, the company was also developing their own proprietary manufacturing process,
Hmm.
which included a certain bioreactor with a packed bed, various ways of basically generating large numbers of cells for an allogeneic cell therapy. And that gave me really interesting and good exposure to manufacturing, what the considerations are, what the limitations are, how to think about it. And that sort of led me down the path of eventually moving to the CDMO space and really focusing on how we manufacture to make sure that these therapies get to more patients. And I think was really interesting for me in the CDMO space was not only that there is a big focus on that interface between technology and biology, but also that you're exposed to so many different types of cells, types of processes, different companies, right? You're not locked into only CAR T, right? So
Hmm.
I've gained experience over the years in almost every cell type, every therapy type that's related to cell therapy and gene therapy.
Wow. Wow, that's fascinating. So let me ask you, having seen things from both sides, when a biotech or a pharma company is evaluating CDMOs for cell and gene therapy, what are the most critical questions they should be asking, but they don't?
Right. So it's been a very interesting evolution over time of how therapeutic companies evaluate and choose CDMOs. I think a decade ago, it was almost an afterthought.
Hmm.
And frankly, even from an investor standpoint, investors wanted to see preclinical animal data,
Hmm.
and as soon as that was in place, there was funding. And no one really thought about the fact that one of the biggest challenges and bottlenecks for the industry is actually the manufacturing.
Mm.
I think over time it's become very apparent, right, through trial and error, through the fact that, that some of these early commercial cell therapies were having real challenges in terms of cost and scalability, that this is a critical component.
Yeah. So Eitan, when you're saying this, right, I'm trying to imagine where people are feeling the impact of the bottleneck. So are you saying that essentially demand is outpacing what the companies are able to supply for some of these medications due to manufacturing challenges?
Absolutely. I think there are multiple examples of more demand than supply, and
Hmm.
patients are waiting
Hmm.
for these therapies. And again, these are patients that are, this is their last hope, and they don't have
Right.
much time. And since the therapy is not off the shelf in many cases, if it's autologous, they need their cells to be manufactured, right? So there is definitely a gap, not only in supply and demand, but also in terms of just what the price point is versus what can be afforded by private or public payers.
Hmm. Hmm. Talk to me about that element because I'm not quite tracking where the price point piece comes into things.
So I think one of the elements of cell therapy across the board, especially for autologous cell therapies, but also for
Hmm.
allogeneic, is that the manufacturing processes are complex. They're immature from a standpoint of not being very closed and automated. They're still quite manual and open.
Hmm.
And that, in addition to that, raw materials, which are quite expensive because they're not widely used,
Mm.
and that results in a very high cost of goods
Right.
of the therapy itself. And then when you add on to that, obviously the margins that therapeutic companies need to get to continue developing new therapies, it results in very high prices for the patients or for the payers that are paying for the therapies. We're talking about, for, as an example, for a CAR T, hundreds of thousands of dollars, and
Hmm.
for gene therapies, millions of dollars, right?
Hmm.
As a price point. Obviously, that might be okay for indications that are life or death,
Hmm.
and for a very small number of patients. But since we're getting now to this place where it's becoming more widely used for larger indications,
Right.
then it's really not sustainable. So as an example, and Americans don't always think about this, right? But in European countries where it's a public payer system,
Hmm.
they basically have a bucket of money earmarked to buy and pay for therapies.
Yes.
If that bucket is exceeded, then somebody's not getting that drug. So, with such expensive therapies, it's just not going to be possible and get these therapies to the patients that need them. And that's where we come in, right?
Yeah.
Partially, right? As a CDMO and we're working really hard at Minaris on how do we actually get the cost of goods manufactured down
Right.
so that more patients can receive the therapies.
Have you seen, just speaking about the difference between Europe and US, and talking to others, one of the, use a pharma term, the side effects of this whole favored nation pricing legislation that's being pushed by the current administration is that sometimes pharma companies are saying, you know what, we're just not going to launch in Europe, right? And I would imagine this is even, I don't actually know, but I would imagine that for something rare and for something very expensive like cell and gene therapy, you might be seeing that. Are you seeing companies actually change their distribution plans based on this policy?
I mean, I don't know that based on this policy per se,
Hmm.
because it's the
Hmm.
very early days, but I
Hmm.
can say that definitely there is more of a reluctance to launch these therapies in Europe because the challenge of negotiating reimbursement
Right.
to the level that is deemed by the therapeutic companies reasonable,
Yeah.
right? So that is definitely a challenge for therapeutic companies. And
Yeah.
again, there are various ways that this needs to be addressed, and it does need to be addressed, right?
Yeah.
But the biggest one, really, in my opinion, is reducing cost equities so that in turn the therapeutic companies can reduce the price.
That makes a lot of sense, right? Because it seems like, again, this is from a semi-outsider's perspective, not a true outsider, I guess. It seems like a lot of these systems, both around reimbursement, around insurance, around everything, is kind of built up over decades around the traditional pharma model, which is that most of the cost of the drug is in the development, and then the pill itself is actually pretty cheap to manufacture. And this is a completely different scenario where it's expensive and oftentimes it's pretty rare, right? So it's not like there are massive economies of scale that are coming about. So how are you looking at, like, figuring out what are the big opportunities to solve the bottleneck and to reduce prices for creating these medications?
Right. No, that's a great point. I think that it's overlooked that it's a combination of factors, right? I think on one hand, traditional small molecule margins that a large pharma are used to won't work for this because, again, to your point, the cost of manufacturing is going to be higher, and it's not going to get lower to the numbers where chemistry and small molecules are. But I think that that's why we are focused on, okay, what is the gamut of elements that we need to bring into play to impact cost? And
Hmm.
it's not one magic bullet, it's many things that need to happen simultaneously, right? One of them is economies of scale, right?
Hmm.
As we scale, we can create that to reduce costs, but there are many other things. There's, as I mentioned, the cost of the raw materials. There's, how do we get to a point where we have less hands-on time in manufacturing the therapy? The biggest cost is manpower.
Yeah.
And these are skilled people, obviously. But how do we reduce that drastically by closing and automating manufacturing? How do we get to a point where obviously we're not failing batches, because a failed batch is obviously could be
It's
life
patient
and death
lives.
for patient, but it's also expensive because you're manufacturing something that never ends up reaching the patient and getting reimbursed, right? So there are many factors. We have to bring them all together, and that's something that's happening, but it takes time, and it also takes some new technologies to be adopted. Another key element is testing. These therapies undergo quite rigorous testing.
Right.
And if you think about it, as opposed to a therapy where you're making one batch to treat many patients, so your testing component, you amortize it across patients. It's not significant, but for this, since every patient has a full testing schedule, then the cost of that suddenly becomes very critical as well.
Yeah. So my biggest exposure to this has been working with a CAR T company, and even just everything about their business is different, right? Where it's from apheresis collections. There's time involved there, which again, I'm thinking about it from the patient perspective, right? It's like you need that time to be as short as possible, both for reduced costs, but also just because you really need the medication. And so are you seeing technological innovations that you think are going to be, you had mentioned closed systems, improved testing methods. Are you seeing advancements on the near-term horizon that are going to impact this?
So we are, I am, and definitely some of them are already on the market. Some of them are hopefully coming. But we focus on three things, and I can elaborate a little bit on what technologies are coming in to support that. But one is, as we've been talking about, how do we reduce cost of goods? The second is how we reduce the turnaround time to get the therapies faster to the patient, and their manufacturing, but also testing has a big element. And thirdly, how do we really get to a point where we're manufacturing at a very high percentage success of batches, so we don't have failures, right? And I think that there's some technologies like Miltenyi Prodigy, like the Lonza Cocoon system, like the Ori Biotech system, like there are a bunch of systems aimed at closing and automating some or all of the manufacturing process.
Yeah.
And those are very important things. There are also some upcoming technologies in the testing side, like use of NGS, right, method to do release testing as opposed to compendial testing methods from 50 years ago, to do it faster and to do it cheaper, and frankly also to do it in a way that that gives us more data to understand the therapy and understand the cells and improve. So there are things, I think, that we need to keep working and developing these things, but also we need to adopt them, right? One of the key challenges is the therapeutic, the pharma industry is a very conservative industry, right? And adoption of new technologies and new methods is not always the simplest thing, right? So I think as an industry, especially in cell and gene therapy, we have to make sure that we have our minds open and that we're adopting the right technology to enable treating more patients.
Yeah, just hearing you speak, this seems like an area where selecting the right CDMO is maybe even more critical than in traditional small molecule medicines, where it's less of a requirement to have innovation, but here innovation is necessary. And so, are the things that you're talking about changes you're hoping to see implemented kind of as industry-wide standards, or are these areas that you're pushing the envelope at your particular organization?
Yeah, I think for sure it's some of both. And you asked me earlier about how do people choose, right? So I think the sort of old-fashioned way of approaching it is, the CDMO just needs to execute, and I'm going to throw my process over the fence, and you just run it,
Right.
you do it, and end of
Right.
story.
We told you
Right.
what the drug needs to do, and then you deliver them on time and with
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
certain quality, and your job is complete.
Right. And I think those are still obviously key elements, but
Hmm.
because the space is still nascent and because things are still developing, and because frankly a lot of the biotechs that work on these therapies are not experts
Hmm.
on the manufacturing and testing side, working with a CDMO that has the depth, the ambition to change things for the better, and the mindset of really collaborating to make it work and for the therapy to be successful commercially, those are critical elements. And I know that in the current funding environment, a lot is really focused on how much is it going to cost me. And again, I don't think that's a unreasonable
Sure,
thought
of course.
process. It
Right.
still has to be competitive, but thinking about ultimately, are we going to be successful commercially with this therapy? That takes a village, right? It
Yeah.
takes a village and it takes strong partnership.
Yeah, and the reason I keep asking these questions about things from the pharma side is because honestly, that's most of my audience is in the pharma space. So let's say let's put ourselves in their shoes, and you're one of these biotechs. Maybe they're about to launch their first product, choose their first CDMO partner. If they don't have that expertise in-house to do a proper evaluation, how would you recommend that they get that expertise and kind of up level themselves around what even questions should we be asking and how do we make these complex and these are long-term decisions that have a major impact on the success of a company.
Absolutely. I mean, the way that we look at this is that, you're giving the CDMO your baby essentially, right?
Right.
And if they fail, then you fail as a therapeutic company because you don't have a second chance usually, right? You have this is a one-shot thing, right? Either you succeed or you don't. So that we very much acknowledge and are aware of that. I think there are various ways of doing it. I mean, obviously there are consultants out there. There are consulting firms. You can also obviously recruit someone that has the right experience in terms of outsourcing and working with CDMOs. But I think, frankly, ultimately, this should not be rocket science, right? When you go to a CDMO and you do a site visit, and you talk to the people there about your therapy and about the considerations and about the bottlenecks and what you should be worried about. I think if you have reasonable experience in the space, even minimal, I think you get it, right. This is not something that is, as we're discussing here, right? These are not things that are super difficult to understand. Obviously, when
Hmm.
you get to the more granular technical level, it's a
Right.
little bit different. But I think you can gauge, what the attitude is.
Yeah, it's funny. You saying that reminded me of a conversation I had around this topic with another person where he was describing the importance of a site visit. And what he was saying was that his evaluation, basically, it starts from as soon as he gets towards the front door with, is everything, he wants everything clean. He wants, is the
Yeah.
glass clean? Is it presentable? When you go in, are people looking frenzied? Or is there clean workstations? Everybody is operating, in a way that feels manageable and very well put together. So that person was saying that the site visit was an incredibly important part of the evaluation. But I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense, right? Where it's like you have the big picture questions, certainly around cost, speed, and quality, and then everything else can flow from there. So let me ask you, Eytan, if we can just switch gears a little bit, because I think that this is part of your background that is very interesting to me. But you've worked across public companies, venture-backed environments, private equity-backed firms. Have you noticed a difference in how these different models shape decision making, risk tolerance, long-term strategy, et cetera?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, look, you know, acknowledging here that I have an N of one, right?
Right, right. This is you're just sharing your experience. We're just talking.
Right.
It's
No, no,
fine.
for sure. I just, I do tend to stay for a while once I join, so
Sure.
I don't have a huge N for each of those. But yes, I mean, I do think that they're different drivers
Hmm.
right, for different scenarios. And I think it's what you would expect, right? I mean, the public companies are looking more for the quarterly or yearly reporting, right, that they have to give, and what does that look like, and what do the obviously the stakeholders, which are the investors among others, have to say about it, and the stock price, etc. And again, there are pros and cons to the fact that that is a key driver. Venture capital, more, less risk averse, in the sense that, yes, they're investing in something big that has significant chances of failure, even if it is a CDMO in some cases.
Hmm.
Right, but also the bandwidth in terms of the time frame that is available to make it work or make it not, or
Yes.
fail, is sort of quite limited.
Right.
And then private equity, which has a horizon of, call it 5 to 7 years, but obviously in many cases acquiring companies that are not doing very well, and
Right.
it's a turnaround situation where you have to make some quite difficult, significant, quick decisions
Yes.
to stabilize and get the company to where it needs to be.
Yeah, that's so I've worked myself for all three company types, and I think the time horizon is one that maybe earlier on in my career I underestimated how impactful that is to somebody working for one of these companies. I mean, with biotechs, it's kind of self-explanatory. If you're joining a pre-commercial launch, your trials need to go well and your drug needs to launch successfully, right? And that's the whole future of the company. But what I thought was fascinating when you were talking about the short horizon for VC firms, I'm not sure how this is in the CDMO space, but in software organizations, it's like they're going to send you up like a rocket ship, and if you make it to space, great, but 9 out of 10 are going to explode in the atmosphere, and that's just part of the model, right? And so that can be a very weird place to operate, and it's something that honestly I'm sometimes surprised more like procurement folks aren't interested in what are the models and where does that mean, but I'm assuming CDMOs aren't quite that, 3 years boomer bust. Hopefully you get a little bit more runway.
Right, right. No, that, yes, because you need that, and I think that one thing I have found, which is sort of obvious, right, is that the composition, sorry, of your investors, and who's on the board, is so critical, right? I mean, if you really have those people who have the depth and have the experience, and not just experience period, but experience in the space that's relevant, right, to
Yep.
what you're doing, because it's quite nuanced, right? I mean, someone
Yeah.
who has lots of experience from the FDA or lots of experience from therapeutic or large pharma companies doesn't necessarily know how CDMO works, and vice versa, right?
Hmm.
So having that experience and depth and support by your investors and on the board is really important for success.
Nice. All right. Well, let's end with just one forward-looking kind of thought experiment, if you will. So let me ask you, Eytan, for leaders building in this space today, what mindset or capability will be most important to succeed over the next 5 to 10 years?
As an individual.
Yeah, as you can take that however you want. As an individual to bring success to your organization, where do you see sort of the change happening, and what are people going to need to? What should people be spending their time on now so that they can be successful in the immediate future?
Yeah, well, I think, on the therapeutic side, I think, to your point, um, choosing, which daycare you put your baby at, right, is absolutely critical, right?
Yep.
So doing that assessment and really understanding that you're working with the people, that they have the right depth and experience and commitment and partnership mindset, right? Because your expertise is developing as a therapeutic company. Your expertise primarily is developing the therapy, right, and understanding the biology and doing the clinical trials, and that's exactly what you should be doing,
Hmm.
right? You don't always have that depth and understanding and capability in terms of manufacturing. And by the way, again, when money was free, biotech were building their own in-house manufacturing because money was free, and
Right.
then almost everyone has moved away from that because they've understood it's not efficient capital use, and it's also a distraction because it's not their core competency as a therapeutic company.
Yeah, well, can I just like the thing that's interesting about that in the cell and gene therapy space is it seems like in the traditional space you can say, all right, well, manufacturing isn't so much a place where you can gain a competitive edge because not to oversimplify, but it is simpler. But here it actually seems like if you were to bring that in-house, and granted that would be a hugely expensive proposal, I'm assuming, could that not be a competitive advantage for your company long term if you were really good at this complex manufacturing piece?
I suppose that in some scenarios it could be, but it's hard for me to think about what they would be, right? I mean, I think once commercial stage, if you want to bring it in-house, sure, that's a possibility. You're going to need dual sourcing anyway, but as long as you're in the clinic and you don't even know if you're going to succeed commercially,
and you have no revenue stream,
no rationale in doing that. And actually, you bring up a really important and interesting point, which is that it's almost the reverse with cell therapies because you can't patent the target, right? So in small molecules, you can patent the molecule. In cell therapy, you're not patenting a molecule and you can't patent the target because it's a naturally occurring biological element, right? So actually almost the only place, or one of the only places that you can create differentiation is the manufacturing. And since multiple companies are going after the same target, for instance, CD19, right? If you can be at a lower price point, that might be enough to really create that differentiation, which will drive market share for you. So I think almost in a dichotomy to small molecules, manufacturing is super important.
Yes, I love it. All right, let's end it there. This is one of the things I just love about this space is there are endless wrinkles to the pharma industry, right? And just when you think you have a sense of it, there's something new. So Eytan, thank you very much for your time. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you. It's been great.
This episode of Pharma Sessions is sponsored by Exunt, makers of the X1 reporting platform.
And that's a wrap on today's episode of Pharma Sessions with me, Jonathan Kaskey. If you enjoyed today's conversation, don't forget to hit follow or subscribe and share it with someone else in the pharma world who might need to hear it. For more on pharma trends, career growth, and business strategies, connect with me, Jonathan Kaskey, on LinkedIn. Until next time, thanks for listening.